information on prevention, tools for a healthy lifestyle. Make little changes to be the best you. It's all here. A podcast empowering, informing, and motivating Bermuda to live well. Bermuda Health-Abets. Everything from A to Z on healthy living. Brought to you by the Health Promotion and Wellness Office of the Department of Health in collaboration with local health partners.
Welcome to another episode of Bermuda Health-Abets, a podcast where we discuss everything from A to Z on healthy living with the mission of empowering, informing, and motivating Bermuda residents to live well. I'm your host, Yosifia Spence, from the Health Promotion and Wellness Office at the Department of Health, and I am a public health educator. And I'd like to welcome our guest, Juane Crockwell, from the Women's Resource Center. And our topic today, just before we get into a bit more about Juane, is strategies for recognizing and preventing domestic abuse. Welcome, Juane, and welcome to our audience. Thank you for tuning in to our episode today. Juane, can you give us a bit more about yourself and your organization?
Yes, of course. So, as you said, my name is Juane Crockwell, and I'm the Executive Director at the Women's Resource Center. I've been there since March 2023, so I still feel like I'm new. It hasn't been 2 years yet, but the Women's Resource Center is an advocacy and support organization specifically for women in Bermuda, and we provide counseling, support services, community education, and we also have an advocacy program to raise awareness about community issues that directly impact women.
Okay. That's very nice to hear. I'm a woman, so I'd like to know where my resources are. Right?
Yes.
And so, obviously, our topic today is kind of a heavy one.
It is.
Right? But it is important to recognize the signs and recognize what domestic abuse looks like in terms of whether you're a friend of someone or whether you're someone who might be in a situation, and finding out the resources that you can access to, help yourself or help someone else if you are in a position to do that.
Yes.
So just to get started, what is domestic violence or domestic abuse?
Okay, so domestic abuse, or sometimes referred to as domestic violence or intimate partner violence, is an incident or pattern of behavior where someone is trying to control or exert power over another individual. And generally, when we talk about domestic abuse, we automatically think of intimate partner relationships, but domestic abuse also extends to other family dynamics. So domestic abuse can exist between siblings, it can exist between parents and children, but most predominantly we see it between intimate partners.
What about even friendships? Like, I'm sure, you get, although it may not be anything, intimate or romantic, like, is that something that has occurred?
Well, I guess it wouldn't fall specifically under domestic abuse, because I think domestic refers to in the same home, for lack of a better term. You don't always live with the person, but if a friend is abusing you, we would probably just call that abuse, right? Or you're just not a good friend. So domestic abuse relates specifically to like that family dynamic, whether it's with your partner or with other members of your immediate family.
Okay, that's clear.
Yeah.
So when we talk about it, because I know the most common form of abuse that we usually think about is someone physically striking another person. So, you indicated like someone having power or control over a person. So what forms of abuse would you say there are?
So there are several forms of abuse, and you're absolutely correct. When we talk about domestic abuse, we automatically think of physical. We think of black eyes and bruises and broken bones, but that's just one form. That's the form that we can see easily, and it's the most recognizable. It includes, hitting, slapping, choking, but it can also include threats of physical harm. But there's so many other forms of domestic abuse as well. So I'll just go through them really quickly.
Okay.
So we also have emotional abuse, which involves manipulating, undermining the victim, trying to, I guess, impact their self-esteem and their self-worth, their emotional well-being. And that can come in the form of constant criticism, name-calling, public humiliation, isolating them from their friends. You know, it's all in an attempt to make them feel bad about themselves. And in that space, the perpetrator would be able to exert control and dominance over them because they don't feel good about themselves. Then you have psychological abuse, which is very similar to emotional abuse, but that usually involves more manipulation, coercion, things like gaslighting, intimidation. We talk a lot about narcissism these days. That's kind of like a trendy term right now, but narcissistic behavior would fall under psychological abuse. And so the aim of psychological abuse is to basically create confusion and fear in the victim. And then that's how they are able to exert control. And then you have financial abuse, which is something that is being talked about a lot more now. And in financial abuse, basically the abuser is in control of the victim's access to financial resources, right? So either they prevent their victim from working, you know, but then are very, I guess, manipulative with how they allow their victim to access money. Or if the victim does work, they are always, you know, tracking their spending, restricting access to bank accounts and credit cards, or using that as a form of punishment within their relationship. And so that's something that we're seeing is increasing, and it's particularly harmful because that can make it really hard for a victim to leave the relationship if they don't have access
to their money,
to financial resources, or if they don't have financial resources of their own, right? They're totally dependent on their abuser. And then, of course, there's sexual abuse, which people often forget when it comes to domestic abuse, that sexual abuse actually does take place in those domestic relationships. And it includes any non-consensual sexual activity, coercing their victim into sexual acts. And this is something that I think in Bermuda, it happens much more than we would expect.
Yeah, right. I mean, in all honesty, I do believe that for sure because, you know, unfortunately, in a lot of places, there's a culture of that kind of, you know, perspective of that you have to, especially in a relationship. And it's okay to say no if you're not feeling that. It's okay to say no if you don't feel safe. And I know, you know, in places around the world, there, you know, in some places around the world, like, sexual assault within a marriage and so on and so forth. Those have just become things that are being prosecuted now. Where you know, and I don't have any numbers or facts in reference to specific places, but as a person who has kind of looked at this topic and being a woman and recognizing some of the things that we have kind of just been, you know, given rights for. And safety from. Right? It seems so, crazy to some people that you could say, oh, my husband, you know, sexually assaulted me or raped me. And it's, I think that's the understanding the culture now around consent.
Yes, because consent, you know, I think that now in our generation, in today's age, we're talking about consent much more, and we're more, I guess, educated on the fact that we all have a choice. And we can withdraw consent as well. And giving consent once is not eternal
every time,
you know, thing. And so in marriages, in committed relationships, there are often times where, in addition to the other forms of abuse, there is sexual abuse that is taking place, which is really hard to navigate, especially for someone who has been conditioned that they are the property of their partner. And so they don't think that they have the agency to say no to their partner because they've been, you know, they've been emotionally, psychologically, and sometimes physically berated. That they've lost that agency over themselves. And so that's something that we don't talk about as much. And then there's one more form of abuse that's becoming more prevalent. It's digital abuse. So when we think about the way the world's going, we're here on a podcast,
Technology,
right?
yes.
Technology. It can be used to abuse as well. And so what we're seeing now is lots of digital abuse, which involves using social media. So when we think about revenge porn, or you can use social media to stalk someone, to harass someone, emails. Let's just say
blackmail and manipulation, right?
All of that. So we're seeing that coming up a lot because people are finding ways to access their victim through the digital, through technology and the digital world. And so that's something that we're seeing. And I don't think I mentioned verbal abuse, but I think that probably goes without saying that verbal abuse is definitely a form of domestic abuse. Just because someone hasn't physically touched you
doesn't mean
that the words are not harmful and hurtful. And so verbal abuse, of course, is probably the most prevalent form of domestic abuse, because prior to something becoming physical, there's usually an exchange of words, right? So verbal abuse is definitely up there, up top with the most prevalent forms of domestic abuse.
Well, I did learn something new. I knew physical, I knew mental and emotional and verbal, but the digital abuse and even the financial, like I had some idea of financial, but not to the extent that you've explained it. It's really interesting because then maybe persons could actually recognize if they are in those situations. So what is the most common signs of domestic abuse, and how can someone recognize them?
So I think
early, or even just recognize them in general.
So of course every person and every situation is going to be different, and the different forms of abuse will have different signs. So for physical abuse, it's usually easier to recognize because you're actually going to see unexplained injuries or bruises, frequent accidents. And I know people can't see me, but I'm using quotations, frequent accidents, or if they're talking about their partner, you can see fear and anxiety on their face and in their body. That could be a sign of physical abuse. And then with emotional abuse, you tend to see a lot of isolation. So they don't want to be around their friends anymore. They have low self-esteem. You can see a change in their personality and their mood. And so that could be a reflection of how they're feeling about themselves as a result of the abuse. Some signs of psychological abuse and manipulation, when your partner is gaslighting you, right? Kind of blowing you off every time you try and point out something about them. They're deflecting and turning it back on you. Or constant criticism. You can't do anything right, constantly being criticized, or making you feel like you're in the wrong all the time. That could be a sign of psychological abuse. As we mentioned before, financial abuse, restricting your access to money or trying to control everything that you spend your money on, insisting that you don't work. And of course, these are all relative, right? So I don't want listeners to be sitting in fear thinking, oh my goodness, my partner doesn't want me to work, so that's financial abuse.
And I was going to get to that, right?
Because like I said, in every relationship, the dynamics are different. But for some, the motive is to control by limiting your access to financial resources. So you have to kind of look at it in its full context, and also it's important to remember when you talk about signs and recognizing abuse is that the different forms of abuse rarely happen in isolation. So there's usually going to be multiple forms of abuse happening at the same time.
Okay.
Right?
Really?
If someone is financially abusive, then they're most likely mentally and emotionally abusive as well. When it comes to physical abuse, that usually isn't the first sign of abuse. That first time that your partner physically harms you is generally an accumulation of other instances where there has been abuse that may not have been physical, right? So that's important to remember too when we talk about signs and recognizing the abuse, that it doesn't always start with a physical altercation.
Right.
It doesn't always start with them, cutting up your credit cards or taking you off their bank account. Generally, there are other forms, the mental, the emotional, the verbal, the psychological, that come before those more drastic forms of abuse.
Okay. Yeah, I mean... No, I'm just... I'm processing, right? For a few seconds.
Yeah.
It's heavy, but it's so necessary, right?
It is.
When we talk about domestic abuse, most people probably think adults and couples, right? But I'm now thinking about what happens as well in the teenage world, because they're dating, they have partners, and do some of these things occur even within that population? When we think about domestic abuse, we're likely thinking more specifically around the adult years. Yeah. So that just thinking about how to deal with something so heavy for anyone, and then recognizing that this can also occur
to teenagers,
other populations.
And that's really such a good thing to mention, because part of the Women's Resource Center's goal is to not just respond to the women in crisis, but to also empower young girls to recognize what a healthy relationship looks like, recognize these signs. Because right now it's really with social media and that instantaneous access to everybody, relationships, and I have a teenager, right? And I have a teenage son, and thankfully, he hasn't had any serious relationship yet, but I observe the way he communicates with some of his friends, and I'm just I have to tell him all the time, that's not healthy. Them constantly messaging you and being upset because you took a long time to answer. I'm just seeing, red flag, red flag, red flag.
I mean, I have a 13-year-old who's about to be 14, and I also, have had to have those conversations. It's not even just about friends. It's when they're calling me and I don't answer right away.
Yes.
And you've called me 10 times, right? So I have to send a message back and say hey, I'm in a meeting or I'm at work, and if I don't answer your call, I am going to get back to you. I'm not ignoring you. I am going to get back to you, but you have to kind of relax. Yeah. And so the other thing is, I'm thinking as well, as you're saying, when we recognize these red flags, kind of just addressing them and maybe sharing some healthy, approaches to those things. But I even the thought of certain things that might be happening with some of their friends when it comes to mental health, and them feeling responsible to be there, and they're not telling us, and so on and so forth. And every time something happens with their friends, they're stepping in to assist, and they're not involving adults. But now, what is happening with that child who's taking on everything that's going on with their friends in reference to
their own mental health?
Right. Yeah. And so just healthy relationships,
and that's the key, really. And I know we've kind of diverted from the original question,
yes.
But when I think about young people, we really have to instill in them what healthy relationships look like, because technology has changed how we relate with each other, and so young people need to know that when you're in a relationship with someone, they're not your property. You don't have to be at their beck and call. You don't have to do everything that they say. You don't need to know their every move, because social media has created a society where that's normal. Posting everything you do, and there's so many ways
putting your location on. Like that to me, and maybe because I am a different person, I don't need to know your every move. you know what I mean? I don't need to know what you ate for lunch.
Yeah.
And like you said, context early as well. The type of relationship you have. So let's not think that, the things that I'm saying is representative of people being in abusive relationships. But what I'm saying is this concept or this thought that, you need to know everything that's going on.
Accessibility.
Like trust is a thing, and I have a friend who has satellite or who puts on location, and you're following where your partner is and all of this stuff, and I'm just like, you're spending most of your time doing that. What are you doing with your day?
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's one of the concerns when we think about that younger generation who are growing up in this social media age, this age of extreme accessibility. How is that going to impact them as adults in relationships? Are they going to understand boundaries? Are they going to struggle when it comes to control of their partner? And so those are things that, from the Women's Resource Center perspective, we want to be working with teenage girls to be able to equip them for relationships as an adult, because the digital abuse, it's so vast, right? It's so vast. Even people just slide in your DMs and say all kinds of crazy stuff. Sending explicit photographs
without
and this isn't even
stuff.
Your partner, right? So we're not even talking about domestic abuse in this instance. But if this is what young people are participating in as teens, I'm concerned for how they're going to show up in their relationships, and so that's something that I think when we talk about preventing domestic abuse, it has to start really early. We're working on building a program for young girls, and we're not going to necessarily talk about domestic abuse, but we're going to talk about ways to communicate healthily. We're going to talk about setting boundaries. We're going to talk about having agency over your body, so that when these young girls mature into adult women, they have those tools and they have the right mindset to be able to go into a relationship and recognize when something isn't healthy.
Thank you. I think we kind of jumped to the prevention component. No, it's fine, because that's what came to my mind when we were talking about, those components that, represent how you recognize the signs, right? And so in thinking about that, I'm like, okay, well, what about teens as well? And some of those forms of abuse, outside people can't really recognize that a person is being abused, and so that self preservation and agency that you talk about is what kind of has to kick in. Just from my thought of the information that you've given.
Most definitely.
And so when we think about it, and some of these signs and some of the things that a person might be experiencing when it comes to domestic abuse, how can people safely intervene if they suspect someone they know is being abused, or and I think that's a challenging.
It's definitely a challenge, and it's a great question that requires a lot of balance. And so we have people who call all the time and they're like, I don't know what to do. My friend's in this relationship. She won't leave. It's getting worse. And so the first, and what I believe is the most important thing that you can do if you suspect that there is abuse happening with someone that is to create a safe space. What we often do is we want to create a safe space. I think that's our desire, but the way we communicate doesn't necessarily make the victim feel safe. And so it needs to be non-judgmental. It needs to be 100% supportive. It's not about telling the person what to do, where they went wrong, because they're already receiving all of that, and they're already feeling pretty.
That you should leave.
Yeah,
or this
they're already
or that.
feeling pretty bad,
support. Yes.
right? And so what you want to do is make sure that you are a safe space for your friend when the time comes for them to seek support. Because one of the biggest reasons and factors for people staying in domestic abuse relationships after recognizing that they need to leave is that they don't feel supported. right? And we'll probably get into that a little bit later. But the first thing that you want to do is create a safe space. You want to listen without judgment, right? This isn't your time to be like, I told you back when you met him that X, Y, Z. Like, this is your time to listen and reserve that judgment. Comments like, I don't know why you just don't leave.
You don't
That's
know.
not
You don't know
helpful.
because you're not in that situation,
Exactly.
right?
And guess what? She might not know why, or he may not know why.
Yes.
They don't just leave either. So the stuff like that, comments like that are not helpful, and they actually end up isolating your friend even more. So the first thing is you have to absolutely create a safe space, and then express your concern in a loving way. Like, hey, I've noticed X, Y, Z. I'm concerned. You can offer to take them or accompany them to a support agency, whether it's the Women's Resource Center or the Center Against Abuse, whether it's making a police report. You can express that concern and follow it up with, tangible support. Be there for them. Outside of that, I really don't encourage people to get too involved,
Right.
because we can cause more harm. And the last thing that you want to do is further alienate the victim. And when the time comes when they're actually ready to leave, they don't reach out because they've felt alienated.
I totally understand that.
Yeah,
I
so
mean,
the main
yeah.
thing is creating that safe space for them.
And also, and I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, you also don't want to make their abuser more aggressive in the situation, right? Especially
Yes.
if they're aware that you may be talking about what's going on or getting assistance from someone else,
Yeah.
right? Which could potentially lead to either further harm or don't really even want to say this, but potential death,
Yeah.
right?
And that's real. If I could just pause there, you said you don't want to say this, but potential death. And it's hard to say, but I think we have to reiterate in the community that domestic abuse can be fatal and has been fatal many times in
Yes.
Bermuda. We can think over the last 5 years, and we can name names, which I won't do, but
Of course
it
not,
can
but yes.
absolutely be fatal.
It can escalate.
It is fatal.
Yes.
So I just wanted to,
Yes.
make sure I put a pin in that for our listeners.
Right.
You know,
I mean, even thinking about emotional and mental abuse, that could also lead
Yeah.
to something fatal
yes,
as well, right?
It could.
And so that I just wanted to mention that as well.
Yeah, of course.
And just in thinking about, you mentioned earlier, the preventive component, and I don't imagine there is a whole lot more you can prevent in reference to domestic abuse because you can't predict
Yeah.
that this is something that may occur. But what preventive measures can be taken to reduce domestic abuse, especially in intimate relationships?
So going right back to that education piece, we want to educate young people about what healthy relationships look like. That can come in the form of workshops. The Women's Resource Center hosts workshops all the time about healthy relationships. So it's not necessarily talking about domestic abuse. It's actually talking about the opposite, so that people have an understanding of what a healthy relationship looks like. If you've never seen a healthy relationship, if you've never experienced a healthy relationship, you genuinely just may not know. And we want to educate the community on what healthy relationships should look like. So that's one way that the community can get involved in that, by attending those workshops and making sure that they're educating themselves and their loved ones, especially young people. Also, I think it's important for us as a community to support survivors. Now, that might not be directly one-on-one. You might not actually know a survivor, but there are organizations in Bermuda, as I mentioned, WRC, the Center Against Abuse, who specifically support victims and survivors of abuse. And so if the community can support those organizations, by extension, they're
also supporting
the survivors,
Yes.
and ensuring that there's a safe place for them to go, to be able to recover and rebuild their life. And I think that's one of the biggest issues in Bermuda. Once you make a report of abuse, or once you decide to leave a relationship, you're kind of left on your own after that in some cases. And so at the Women's Resource Center, we want to make sure that no woman feels like she has to figure this out on her own.
Right. And your healing really starts once you leave,
right? Yeah. And so ensuring that organizations like ours and others are there to support survivors. I think that's super, super important. And that's one way that everybody in the community can get involved, whether it's through donations or volunteering, attending our events, sharing our content on social media, just to make sure that we exist.
That awareness component of, being aware that these things occur, being, not, I guess, because sometimes we ignore, especially things like the domestic abuse.
Because it's hard to talk about. It's uncomfortable.
Right. But you know what? I think we should get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Because if you're not comfortable, you're not talking about those important topics. And then we're ignoring it. And then it perpetuates or it gets worse within our communities and leads to those situations that we talked about, like death within our community. And seeing that someone may be having a hard time getting out of those situations, right? And reserving our judgment. Because anybody can be in any situation. We're so judgy all the time.
All the time. I am so passionate about that. And I heard the passion in your voice when you said to reserve your judgment. It is so unhelpful. It is absolutely unhelpful. And we hear that dialogue all the time. People are talking about it. Well, I don't know why she stayed. And she's been with him all these years and he hasn't changed. And just imagine, right? You're a silent victim. You haven't shared, right, about what you're going through. And you're sitting with your friends and they're talking about someone else who maybe the abuse is more public. And you're hearing how they're talking about someone else.
Why would you share what's going on with you?
I am never going to open up. Because they're going to tell me that, or they're going to think that I'm stupid, just like they think that she's stupid, right? And so that judgment, we don't recognize the harm that we are doing to people with our judgments.
And that's why awareness, I think, is so important. Like, I am so happy, even with the heaviness of this topic, I am so happy that we're having this conversation today. Because of that whole perspective of we have these views of things and we've done very little research or we have very little experience and with something and we have an opinion on it. And hey, people are entitled. You have your opinion, but I think being more aware, being more educated, and is so much more. It's so much more useful for us as community members, right? Being someone within the community that you can support your fellow people, that you can have respect for other people. And respect sometimes may also mean that reserving your opinion, especially with very little experience or knowledge of a situation or topic, right? Sometimes we talk just to have an opinion, right?
And it's like,
and so thinking about, okay, what does it mean when you're being judgmental or when you're judging situations that you have no experience with? And I just, me as a person, I do try my hardest not to be that way because we all can find ourselves being a little judgmental in situations. But being aware is, I think, very important. I
just wanted to, if I could quickly just circle back because your question about prevention of abuse in intimate partner relationships, and I just want to make sure that I emphasize that there are things that you can do within your relationship as well. So I already talked about what the community can do, but within your relationship, you want to have good communication. Poor communication is one of the number one reasons why abuse happens in a relationship because there's not open, safe, honest conversation that takes place. So making sure that you're having, really good communication in the early stages of your relationship is super important. Setting boundaries, right? So when you engage in a relationship, that person isn't your boss. That person isn't your parent, right? That person is your partner.
Right, exactly.
And so there should be boundaries. You should have certain authority over yourself and your life and your choices. And so you want to set those boundaries early in the relationship, right? And then also, I think it's important if you start to notice things that make you uncomfortable in your relationship. And I'm not saying that it's necessarily abuse, but if something is making you uncomfortable, you need to be able to speak to your partner about it. Those are ways that we have found can help minimize the escalation of abuse by having those healthy habits in your relationship from the outset. And of course, if you suspect, feel, recognize that there might be abuse in your relationship, seek therapeutic support early as well. I just want to add that in.
No, thank you, because I think that's important as well for the individuals. Like you say, you don't always know.
Yeah.
But setting those boundaries early, I do think would be helpful, right? And you talked about communication being one of the main things that contribute to domestic abuse or violence. And I know we're wrapping up here,
Right.
but just thinking about that as well, is that also in the individuals and what might be going on with those individuals and experiences of, like you said, having an idea of or recognizing what a healthy relationship looks like, maybe experienced abuse or seeing abusive relationships. I don't know if you would say that those sort of things also contribute to
Most definitely.
Abusive relationships.
Most
and,
definitely.
In those situations, really, would you think that it's then really just for those persons to go and heal separately rather than being in abusive relationships? Or how does that,
Yeah.
how would you think about that?
I mean, that would be the ideal, right? Because hurt people hurt people. We've heard that saying before. And so perpetrators, WRC, we're not really in the business of supporting perpetrators, but perpetrators often need some form of therapeutic intervention. I personally want to believe that we are all inherently good, and things happen to us over the course of our life that changes how we show up. And so we need therapeutic healing to unpack those things so that we can show up as the good person that we really are. But without that self-awareness that, certain things may have impacted me and who I am and how I treat people, without access to support, without healthy examples of relationships in the community, it's going to be really hard for someone to even recognize that they are abusive.
Right. I honestly do believe that. 'Cause
Most abusers don't even think they're
I'm
abusive.
with you on that perspective of, like, people are inherently good. You don't start off wanting to just hurt someone, right?
No, we don't.
So my question for you is, how does your work at Women's Resource Center contribute to, addressing and supporting persons who may be experiencing domestic abuse in Bermuda?
So at the Women's Resource Center, of course, we do things like this. We talk about it, right? We raise awareness and we advocate. But in more tangible ways, we provide counseling support to survivors of domestic abuse. So the Women's Resource Center, we're not a crisis intervention center. We're not the place that you should call immediately in a crisis. That should always be the police, right? And then once the crisis has been addressed, the Women's Resource Center is here to support survivors as they navigate the days and weeks and months and years after the crisis. And so we provide counseling support. We also have a hardship fund where if women are challenged financially, when it comes to leaving an abusive relationship, we try to provide practical support, because the last thing that we want is that a woman is going to stay in a relationship because she can't afford to leave, right? And so that's something new that we've implemented. And so where we fit kind of in the support services when it comes to domestic abuse is ongoing support. We're not the first point of contact, but we liaise with the Bermuda Police Service, the Center Against Abuse, to be able to support survivors post-crisis, in rebuilding their life, in not returning to the domestic abusive relationships, and in doing the work to identify how they can prevent themselves from being in that kind of situation again.
Okay, thank you. What can persons do or someone do if they maybe witness, like visually or through sound, someone potentially being abused?
I would say call the police. If you're a neighbor and you hear frequently, every relationship and every family has disagreements, right? So we have to
Loud
use
arguments
discernment,
happen.
right? Because sometimes I be shouting at my kids, and I'm like, "Ooh, let me quiet down before the neighbor thinks something's going on." So, we have to use discernment. But if you can recognize a pattern, then you can call the police, because you've recognized and you can establish this pattern. If you hear something that is indicating that people are unsafe, you want to call the police.
Okay.
What you don't want to be is a bystander. You don't want to know that something is happening
and
around
that you could have done something about it,
and you didn't intervene. And of course, like we talked about earlier, you want to create a safe space for support. You want to reserve your judgment. But if you're literally witnessing something, you can call the police.
Okay.
Most definitely.
And so maybe for persons who might be who want to reach out for support, or even persons who might want to help a friend or anything like that, what is your contact information that people can contact you on? Maybe a phone number or email address?
So the Women's Resource Center phone number is 295-3882. We also have a website, www.wrcbermuda.com, which has all of our programs and services. You can also register for support such as counseling, hardship, etc. right there. And then our email address is wrc@wrcbermuda.com. And we're open Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., regular business hours. So yeah, if you feel like you could use some of the support that I've talked about, please reach out.
Thank you so much. This was a very important topic. If you had just one more thing that you would leave with our audience before we go, what would you say?
That's a good question. This might not sound like it's related to domestic abuse, but it is. I would love the audience to remember that we are all worthy of healthy, happy, safe, and fulfilling lives. We're all worthy of that, and that's what we should be pursuing, because we deserve that.
Thank you so much. That was a very enlightening and discussion, and I thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Again, audience, we were here with Wanae Crockwell, and look out for this space for more Bermuda Health-Abets episodes. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You have been listening to Bermuda Health-Abets. Please note, anything you heard on this podcast is not a substitute for visiting your healthcare provider. If you have a topic or want a question answered, please contact the Health Promotion and Wellness Office of the Department of Health by emailing healthpromotion@gov.bm or by calling 278-4900. Be sure to listen out for the next episode of Bermuda Health-Abets.